Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started here. So tonight we are with Vance Crowe, and he is the Director of Millennial Engagement at Monsanto. And Vance is a former communications strategist for the World Bank Group, a returned U.S. Peace Corps volunteer who is stationed in Kenya, a former communications coordinator at an NPR station in Northern California, and was a deckhand on an ecotourism ship that traveled in the Western Hemisphere. Vance holds an undergraduate degree in communications and sociology from Marquette University and a master's degree in cross-cultural negotiations from the Seton Hall of Diplomacy. Vance lives in St. Louis with his wife, Annie, and his dog, which I do not know how to pronounce your dog's name, even though you told us how to pronounce it. So you can introduce us to your dog.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming out on a Thursday night. I understand there's a basketball game in town as well, and so I'm actually quite impressed with how many people showed up tonight. And this is an interesting experience to come to one of the great agriculture programs in the United States and have something to say to you. Right? As the director of millennial engagement for Monsanto, this kind of curious title, I think it's probably a good place for me to start. Why does Monsanto have a director of millennial engagement? But I'll just talk about that for just a second because it's not actually what I wanted to talk about. The reason that I was invited is because I met one of your classmates, Jordan Gall, quite some time ago, and he invited me to come and speak to the Farm Bureau collegiate version at UW-Madison. And it was an interesting request because as I see the work that Jordan and actually your club does, I recognize that there is very little that I have to talk with you about, like, let me help you understand what GMOs are, or let me help you understand how pesticides work, because I would be willing to bet that there are people in this room that actually have deeper knowledge in these domains than I do. So what then will I be bringing to this group if with a lot of the things that I go out and talk with other people about is something you already know deeply? And so this actually has been a challenge that has perplexed me quite a bit. And I've thought for quite some time, because Jordan is an extraordinarily organized young man that planned this for quite some time. And so it's been pressing on me for quite some time. And so I'm going to take a little bit different tack with this group on what I talk about than what I normally talk about. But to begin, why does Monsanto have a director of millennial engagement? Well, for many, many years, the company believed, hey, we're an agriculture company. So we have customers that are farmers. And in order to find out what problems they have that we can go out using science and technology to solve, we have to build really solid relationships with our farmer customers. And so we're really good at that. And then over on the other pole, we're a publicly traded company. And a lot of people are surprised to find out that on Wall Street, we're considered one of the most transparent companies out there. If we go to the market and say we have a technology, we think it's going to have this kind of an impact, the market believes us because we've come there consistently and told them these are our successes, these are where we've fallen short. And so we've built a very solid relationship there. And so for many years, the company thought we only need to go out and talk to these two groups of people. But what they failed to realize is that in between these two poles are literally billions and billions and billions of people. And I don't know how many of you are from small towns, but if you're from a small town, you're probably quite familiar with the fact that just because you are not involved in a conversation does not mean people aren't talking about you, right? They are talking about you. And for Monsanto, those conversations went on for a very long time, and we did not engage. And after some time, it became very clear that the public had been first suspicious about some of the technologies that we were putting out into the world, or some of the practices that our business had. And that suspicion, when it went unanswered, turned into fear, and in some cases even into anger. And so about 4 years ago, the company took responsibility for the fact that they had not been engaging with the broader public, and they tried to reorganize how they were going to do communications to get out and talk with people that they don't sell anything at all to. And so I am in that role of one of the people that they've asked to go out and talk with general consumers to find out what are their concerns, what is it that they are upset about, are there things that we can answer, are there things that we should be aware of that people are upset about that we as a company should be talking about and changing. So that's my role. And so what that draws me to doing most of the time is to go out to consumer audiences, many of whom are generations away from the farm and have almost no knowledge at all of farming, and talk with them about what are some of the challenges that farmers have and how do our technologies help them. But as I said before, since the group that invited me here is the Collegiate Farm Bureau, I think there is a lot about farming that you know that even I don't. So I puzzled for quite some time about what I would come and talk to this group about. And it dawned on me after some time that if I were, one of the ways that I could think about writing this talk would be to think about what would I want, what would I have wanted if I were in the seats and I were going to hear somebody talking about the future or about the way that the world worked. And I realized that back when I was in college, not so long ago, about 10 years ago, I went to Marquette University. I realized that I actually would not have been in this room. And actually, I'm quite embarrassed of the fact that I wouldn't have been in this room. But the reason that I wouldn't have been in this room was because I was actually quite distracted and quite convinced that I should be afraid of the future. And I became afraid of the future because I think that I didn't really have the right frame set. No one ever gave me a way of looking at the world that would help me understand how can I navigate within it. And so I think it may be something that all of you can relate with, despite the fact that you are in this room. You did take the time to come and spend time with somebody that maybe has different ideas or a different background than you. And the reason that I think I had come to this conclusion was because I had grown up my entire life having been told, Vance, you can grow up to be anything that you want to be. And I truly believed that. And I actually still believe that, and you probably believe that. But there's a really strong double-edged sword that a parent who is giving that gift to their child, or that a teacher is giving to that student, when they say you can grow up to be anything that you want to be, one of the things they don't realize is that a young person then internalizes another very real fact. If you can grow up to be anything that you want to be, well then whoever you become is entirely on you. And so I began to feel this unrelenting pressure on what is it that I will become, what will I do? And I had always heard the mantra, go out and change the world, go out and make a difference. And every time I looked out at the world, I saw how unbelievably complicated it was, and that I didn't have any idea where to even begin if I were going to try and actually make a difference in the world, if I was going to do something good. And so I ended up going on quite a path. If you heard my biography, it might sound like this was a person that was determined to go out and do things in the world, but actually that biography of being a deckhand on a ship, or going out to Kenya, or working in a public radio station in Northern California, that is not the biography of a driven, determined person that knew what they wanted to do. It was a person that was lost, trying to figure out how to make a difference in the world. And so when I think about what it is that I could bring to this conversation, it's to help you guys maybe think of a way so that you can start to understand how to make a bigger difference in the world as fast as possible. Because if there's one thing that I've realized, it is that you all, we all of us as individuals are powerful. You have the ability to make a difference in the world, and if there is a way that I can make a difference in the world right now, it is to show you how you can think about facing complexity in the world. If I can get the slides to advance. There we go. 1. I bring this number up to help you recognize something that you have that is the most valuable thing that you own, and it is your attention. Your attention is literally the most valuable thing that you control. You can put it towards anything that you want, but the catch is you can only put it to one thing at a time. Whatever you put it towards is what you are building towards. And at all times, in order that you are going to think about how will I make a difference in the world, you have to recognize that your attention is something that is so deeply valuable, because nothing gets built unless you know what to pay attention to. You are right now figuring out, what should I pay attention to in school? What should I pay attention to when I'm studying? How should I focus my attention so that I can go out and do something with it in the future? And I bring this thing up here. It is a corn seed, right? And it seems so simple, right? That's the funny thing about the way that the world is. This corn kernel seems like maybe one of the most simple things that you can have. You can grab seeds off of anything out in the wild, or you can grab a bag of seeds, or you can go to the botany department or to the ag department and find seeds and put them in your hand, and they seem so simple. And that's the funny thing about simple things. They aren't ever as simple as you think that they are. And I want you to hold that idea in your mind about just how complicated that seed is without us talking about it. And I want you to focus first on that little chip that has come out of that seed. And to think about, why is it that there is a chip out of that seed? What is it doing? And what makes this photo of a chipped seed so complicated? Now, we're going to change directions just a little bit, and I'll come back to that seed. But if you think about that little chip that came out of it, and then you look at this right here, does anybody know what this is? This is something that your ancestors, my ancestors, all of our ancestors certainly used. It is an Ashwalian hand axe. And for 1.7 million years, it was one of the most complicated tools that human beings had in order that they could interact with the world around them. The interesting thing about an Ashwalian hand axe, if you listen to a writer named Matt Ridley, he talks about how it perfectly fits in your hand. If I were to hand you one right now, it would fit into your hand and into the hand of your parents and into your grandparents, because they're shaped by taking a rock and hitting it with another rock to flake off all the parts that aren't a little tool meant for carving or for digging out. So if you killed an animal and you wanted to cut it open, this was the tool that you had. In 1.7 million years, this is so far in the past that it's difficult for us to always recognize. 1.7 million years, that's way before phones, way before cars or roads or cities or even written words. Human beings hadn't even figured out how to do writing. In fact, that didn't happen until about 10 to 12,000 years ago. This tool has existed for as long as man has been a part of civilization. And now I want to show you what happened about 15,000 years ago. Have any of you ever seen this YouTube channel called Primitive Technology? If there's one thing that I bring to you today, it can be this. This is a YouTube channel of a man that went out into the Australian outback, and he brought nothing with him. And he decided that what he was going to do was to start trying to make the tools and the living conditions that were back in the Stone Age. And this here that he's making, a celt axe, is an interesting thing because it's only been around for about 15,000 years. And I want to show you how much of his attention that he had to apply to this, how much of his thought, how much of his time, in order that he could go from an Ashwalian hand axe to this celt axe. It's sped up. He had to make a wedge in order that he could get a handlebar. One mistake would mean he'd have to start all over again. But now that he has it, he can go out and focus his attention no longer on just making that axe, but being able to chop down trees, which now opens up a whole new set of things that he can start solving. He can start building shelter using actual large trees. He can start collecting firewood. Because he was able to put his attention to this and think about just how much time and how much energy and how much thought went into that. And in order for human beings to be able to even do that sort of technology, they had to figure it out. They had to learn it. Somebody had to say, wouldn't it be better if I didn't have this Ashwalian hand axe in my hand and instead I had it on the end of a branch and I was able to chop with it, right? This is a major advance in society. And now I want to show you something else. $24.99. This is an interesting number. This is the price if one person wanted to go out on Amazon and find the highest rated low-cost axe, which is made out of carbon steel and American elm wood. It's approximately 3 feet long and ground to a perfectly sharp end, and it is made out of steel, right? It would cost you $25, and for an extra $3, you could have it shipped directly to your house. You wouldn't even have to walk outdoors to get it, right? You could have that tool for $25. Now, why else is this interesting? Because right now, and I looked it up and did some back-of-the-napkin calculations, 1 hour of undergraduate education, not including books, not including room and board, 1 hour of your education costs $50. So for the cost of having literally the most valuable tool that someone could have had for 1.7 million years is 1/2 of one lecture that you're paying for at school. This is not only a testament to how powerful capitalism and trade and technology building on itself is, but it is also a testament to how extraordinarily valuable this time right here for you is. We could do this sort of a calculation with all sorts of ways to try and say your time, the things that you're paying attention to, are worth money. But actually thinking of it in terms of that man sitting there cranking out on a piece of stone, right? This is super valuable. And the reason that you want to think about it in this way is because this way you can feel powerful about how should I be spending my attention? What is it that I should be learning so that I can go out and make a big difference in the world? The value of your attention will determine what problems you are capable of solving. And you see, we live in such an interesting age because if any of you, how many of you have a cell phone in your pocket right now? Right? All of us. We have literally access to all of the information that has ever touched the internet right now. There is no information that is out of your reach. And instead, it is your ability to understand how to place this information in context with other things so that you can figure out how to solve problems. So this also then brings me to another concept that feels maybe a little bit further away from the seed and then to the stone axes, which is the yin and the yang sign. I think this symbol is really important for college students to realize. And I wish somebody had pointed out to me what it means, or really what it's trying to get at. Because I used to always think that the yin and the yang sign symbolized good and evil, white and black, somehow these opposing forces. But what I've actually come to learn is that actually what this represents is order and chaos. Order being all of the places around your world that you know, that you understand. And chaos being the entire parts of the world that are unknown to you. The dark forest that you're not familiar with, or the experience of when you came to college and you didn't know what it was going to be like to have a roommate, or you didn't know what your classes were going to be like. That was the unknown. You were stepping into places that you didn't know. Now, the order is where most of the building can occur, right? If you can go out and put things in straight orders or build things or engineer them so that they can be structured and ordered, you can start to get value out of them. But very little new knowledge ever comes from the ordered side. Where new information and new ideas come from is from the chaos. Chaos is not inherently bad. It is just the things that we do not understand. And so if you are going to be paying attention to things, in some ways you have to spend time on the ordered part, figuring out how should I put this in order, but you also have to spend time getting out into the places and the things that you don't know. And I had an experience with that about 3.5 years ago. And I actually kind of love or crave getting out into places that I don't know and things that I don't understand. Remember when you heard my path, right? I had been traveling as a deckhand on a ship in an ecotourism cruise ship. And then I'd lived out in the Peace Corps, living with the people of Kenya, trying to solve problems with malaria and water sanitation. And all the way out in Mendocino, California. And Mendocino is a very interesting place. For the people that think Berkeley, California is too conservative, they move up to Mendocino. And I was working in the back of a train caboose at a national public radio station. So years later, when I'm living in St. Louis and I'm running my own company and I am doing just fine, I see this ad for a job called the Director of Millennial Engagement for Monsanto. And I thought this was hilarious, right? Because everyone that I knew had such strong feelings about who Monsanto was that I thought, well, what the heck, why not apply? Because maybe they'll give me an interview, and who doesn't want to see inside of Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, right? This terribly dark, mysterious place. And so I remember when I was first pulling into the campus, I was immediately disappointed, because I had imagined that I was going to be pulling onto the campus of a place with an 80-story building with dark storm clouds around it and everybody wearing black sunglasses and Matrix-style suits, right? Like that's what I assumed would happen. And so when I came up on a 2-story building that looked more like a college campus, and the woman that greeted me at the front door, her name was Holly, and she was wearing a sweater and had a ponytail, it didn't match my expectations. But I still went into this place because I wanted to see what it was all about. And someday, you guys will be in the position of interviewing for a job that you don't want. And it is about as much fun as you can possibly have, right? Because you're sitting in this interview and you don't really care at all what they're asking you, but you're going to use the time to poke and pry, right? So I sat in about 7 hours worth of interviews because Monsanto is a very intense science place, and so they're really checking out who they're hiring. And the entire time they would ask me a question, I'd give them a very quick, stark answer, and then I'd be like, hey, what about all your pesticides? Or I hear that you sue farmers, back at them as much as possible. And every time that the panel interview would get up and people smiled and they had answered my questions as best they could, they would leave and a new group would come in and I would be looking at the dry erase board to be like, is there plans for world domination written here or maybe over here? And went looking for it, right? And so the whole time I'm just having fun, and I get all the way to the end of the interview and Holly comes back in and she sits across the table from me. And she says, okay, now we've done these interviews, do you have any questions for me? And I said with kind of a smug little smile, yeah, I got a question for you. How are you going to train this Director of Millennial Engagement? And she paused, and she said something that changed the rest of my life. She said, at Monsanto, we're really big on training, and we train the individual based on their skill set and what they like and what they're interested in. And because you've been so curious, the way that I would set up your training is that I would write a list of 50 people from throughout the company. Geneticists, breeders, biologists, soil scientists, physicists, attorneys, farmer customers, and I would have you go talk with each one of them for an hour. And when you get done talking to this list of 50 people, then you'll sit down with me and I'll ask you questions and we'll figure out what you do and don't know about farming and biotechnology and Monsanto. And then I'll write another list of 50 people, and you can go ask them questions. And I realized in that moment that she was handing me something, and I don't think she fully realized how valuable it was, because I was going to get to run around this company that everybody had such strong feelings about. And if I discovered that they were as evil as everyone said that they were, then I was going to go write the greatest tell-all book of all time, right? But that if they weren't, well, then this thing that I had been searching for, right, a problem worth paying attention to, I had just found. because you're talking about now, maybe there's a company that is putting technology out into the world. Maybe it's good and maybe it's bad, who knows? But at least people have been made to feel afraid and no one knows how to get the answers, so I can become a part of bridging that divide. And so by going out into the chaos, even if only just to look because you're curious, led me to completely changing my life, which meant I had a whole new problem because I had to come home and tell my wife that the job I didn't want, I now really, really wanted. And so you never know where the chaos will lead you. But this leads me to a concept that I think you all can apply to your own lives. Have any of you ever heard of this, the Dunning-Kruger effect? This is an interesting one, right? So the Dunning-Kruger effect is a phenomenon that appears across cultures. It doesn't matter where you're from, and it happens with human beings based on how confident are they in what they know about. So if, for example, down here, you're not confident at all, you've never even heard of a subject, or up here, you're very confident, nearly 100%. You would say, I'm an expert in this subject. And on this axis, it is how much time you have spent studying a subject. Now, it turns out that people, and not just the other guy, you too, when you read something, one book, or you watch one documentary, or you have one in-depth conversation, you experience the sensation of having radical confidence in what you know. We have all seen this happen on Facebook, right? Where there's somebody that saw that one documentary and now they are an expert in the field, right? But there's another interesting thing that happens. If you keep studying for not even all that long after you've hit that peak, eventually you hit a point that says, wait a second, the more that I learn, the more I know that there is that I don't know. And you start to become scared, because what ends up happening is you start saying, oh my gosh, everything I learned just tells me how little I knew before, and now I know how much more there is to learn. And the thing about going into that chaos, into crossing over into that black area that you don't know what's going on, is that it's scary. And so most people stop right there. As soon as you start learning things that make you say, the things I thought I knew yesterday aren't true, people mostly turn back and they don't ever go past that. But here's the thing, if you don't ever go past that line and you don't ever have this sensation of, PhD students call this dark euphoria as they head down to the trough of disillusionment, right? That's why you see all these PhD students and you would think they would just be on cloud nine because of how much they know and how much access, but really they're hunched over and they're sad because they know how little they know. But if they keep studying, eventually they start to go up. And you can ask your college professors, ask them, I'm serious, tomorrow go in and ask them, did you experience, when did you start actually re-feeling like you were an expert? When did you go from being the amateur that was way overconfident to actually knowing that you knew about something? And you'll also notice that experts in a field will be very, very tight on what they are actually experts about, because they don't want people to think that they're an expert just in a little bit slightly outside of their area, because they know how much they know and they know how much there is to know about a subject. So this may be, I would hope, compelling you to ask, well, where should I put my attention? Where should I put my attention so that I can get over the Dunning-Kruger high point in my confidence, slide all the way down, and start to go up in my expertise? Because if you go up in your expertise, your skills, your ability to be able to solve ever more complicated problems goes up. So where should I put my attention? And I bring this up, this slide up, which is an interesting one, right? How many of you here already knew that corn comes from teosinte, the plant? How many of you knew this, right? So this is an interesting thing. Many college students, particularly in agriculture, know that this right here, which is a grass that grows throughout Mexico, is the precursor to corn. That's where corn, maize, comes from. But here's an interesting thing. First of all, that has not been known for all that long. And do you know who discovered it? Scientists at the University of Madison, right? And you would think that what they did was they figured out, how did we jump from here to here, right? So you would think that they would be placing their attention on, let's go find some teosinte grass and figure out how they jumped over there. But it's not actually how they figured it out. What they did was something called a novelty search. And I don't even think they knew that they were doing it. This is a term coined by Dr. Kenneth Stanley. He works out of the University of Central Florida. And a novelty search is the thing that I think you can become very good at, and it will help you find problems that are worth solving. What Dr. Stanley realized is that most problems that people solve, the biggest innovations that happen in the world, don't start by somebody saying, I'm on this side of the river and I want to get to that side of the river, so I'm just going to draw the straightest line path and innovate to get there. That's not actually how innovations happen. If you go back and look at how innovations happen, he says they happen through a series of stepping stones, as though you're sitting in the middle of the water and you step on one stone and then you look around and say, where's another stone that I could step on? Oh, there's one. And eventually you get to somewhere, and it may be the other side of the river, or it may just be another interesting place. But what do I mean by that? Well, you guys have already, I think, can tell that I end up getting myself in these weird feedback loops about grandiose plans. And I'm at graduate school, and I'm just about to finish my last semester of my second year in graduate school, and I'm studying diplomacy and cross-cultural negotiations, and I have to write my major paper, right? The last one. This will be the one that will describe the value of all of the work that I've just done for 2.5 years. This is going to be my contribution, the thing that I'm going to give. And so I had to come up with a research question that would explain how much I had learned. And so in order to figure out what my research question was, I went on lots of walks, and I complained to a lot of my friends about how I couldn't figure out what would be the giant research question that I would be able to figure out. And I would wander around thinking about what's the question I should study, what's the thing that if I discovered it, it would make the biggest difference. And I kept coming back to, I don't have any idea, I don't know. And so in an exasperated state, I went to my mentor, this guy named Dr. Zhang Wang, a Chinese professor that was teaching at Seton Hall, and I went and I told him, Dr. Wang, I don't know what I'm going to do. I've been trying to think of these big questions. And this very solemn man who barely ever cracked a smile starts laughing at me. And he just starts uproariously laughing when he hears that I've been trying to think of this grand paper that I could come up with. And so I sit and I think, why are you laughing at me? And he says, Vance, no great paper has ever been written like that. That instead, what you should do is come up with a simple question, one that you don't know the answer to. And what you should do is go look up the answer. Go look and see who has researched this subject. And when you do that, you'll start reading about it. And eventually you'll start to ask yourself, I wonder if they've ever thought of this. And you'll go and look up to see if anybody has ever answered that question, and almost certainly they have. And instead of then saying, okay, well now I can't research that, you start reading everything that they've put out about that subject. And eventually you will come to another question. And you'll say, I wonder if somebody's ever researched that. And you just keep stepping further and further down until eventually you hit a point where you come up with a question that no one else has ever asked. Or if they have asked it, they didn't answer it in a way that actually fulfilled what you think needs to be done, so you can go answer that question. That is the novelty search. And the same thing that can be done on research can be done on problems that you see in your own life. If you are sitting thinking, how will I go change the world? You don't go figure out the large question that you're going to solve. You start to think about, where is the problem closest to me? Which brings me back to this photo. You see, they didn't know for sure that teosinte was the precursor of corn, and so what they did was not what you would think, go get the teosinte and try and breed it out. Instead, what they did, and you should go ask them because I'm sure it's more sophisticated than what I'm going to explain, is that they took this maize and they pollinated it with this right here, and they came up with a weird mutation in between the two. Right? That had some of the hard shell on the outside of the teosinte and some of the soft maize right in between. And then they took 50,000 of these and planted them out in the fields just outside of Madison until they came up with one mutation that looked exactly like teosinte and one mutation that looked a lot like maize. And they knew they had hit on where the original corn came from, and that's how they proved it. A fact that we all know, but it didn't happen in the straight line way that we would have thought. So where should you start, right? Where should you start to look for problems that are worthwhile to you? So on this axis, I have a logarithmic scale, meaning that as you go up that scale, problems become exponentially more complicated, just like a Richter scale, right? And over here, we have who does the problem touch, right? Maybe it touches just yourself, or your family, or your community, or your region, or your country, or your world, right? The further out it goes, it touches more people. Now, it'd be very easy to say, well, the problems that just touch me, they're simple. But anybody in here that has ever had a problem that they've had to deal with, like, how am I going to change something about myself? You know that problems that face you are really, really complicated, right? You can't just force yourself to change or to make some big difference. And so you have to recognize that it is not just simple that you solve a problem that is yourself. But now if you decide, well, I don't want to solve problems that just touch myself. I want to solve problems that touch my family. Well, now you've just gone up in an entire order of magnitude of how complex this problem is. Why? Because just as you are complicated to solve your problems, every member of your family has all of those individual characteristics. They have personality quirks, and they have interests and things that they want, and education levels and blind quadrants and things they don't know about themselves, and vices and virtues. And so as you go up, imagining just which problems you should start to try and solve, how far out they go, the problems get exponentially more complicated. So that leads me to believe that you should always start with the problems that are closest to you. Pay attention to the things that are right around you and see if you can solve them first. Now, that doesn't mean that you should just be focusing on yourself. It could be something as simple as every time I walk through this gate, it falls apart, right? That's a problem for me. So instead of just walking past that problem, if you fix it, now you haven't just fixed it for you. That's why you did it. But it will fix it for everyone else that walks through that gate. Or any other problem that you are starting to learn how to solve. If you see a problem, you own it. That's what this captain that I used to work with, Captain Greg Gordon, he used to always say, if you see a problem, you own it. And the key to that is, if you own a problem, it's no longer good enough to say, somebody else ought to fix this. You're responsible for that problem. So if you're out there seeing that the world needs something to change about it, you're responsible for figuring out how to solve that problem. Which brings me back to the corn that we were talking about. Right? This is an interesting problem. You see, if you want to grow corn and you want it to have the traits that you want it to have, a certain type of resistance to insects that are eating it, or fungus pressure, or maybe you want to add a gene into it so that it's herbicide tolerant, right? You need to know, does inside of that seed, does it have the DNA that it needs, the genes that it needs in the exact right place? And for a very long time, what we would have to do is try and create the seeds with the genes in the places that we thought, and you'd have to take that seed along with tens of thousands of other seeds and place them in rows and water them, and then put fertilizer on them and insecticide and fungicide and protect them and grow them until they got all the way up to being about waist high. And then you would send people out into the fields with hole punches. And they would go to the leaves of the corn plant and they would punch a hole in it. And they would take that little hole punch and they would put it in a vial and they would tag that one corn plant, and then they would ship the little leaf off to a DNA plant and try and find out what's DNA it was, and did it have all of the traits that we wanted into it, so we should save it. And if it doesn't, then we need to get rid of it. And you were doing this for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of corn plants. Think of all the insecticide and the water and the fertilizer that was going into that. So a man named Kevin Depperman said, I wonder if there's a way that we could find out what the DNA of that seed is without having to plant it. But the problem was that if you wanted to get the DNA out of that seed, you had to crush the seed and then go and run its DNA. But if you crush the seed, you can no longer plant it. You've destroyed it. And so people told him it can't be done. And so he sat down for a very long time and thought and tried all these different experiments. And it wasn't until he was at home and he saw his wife's nail file. Remember, we started all the way with the Ashwalian hand axe, got all the way to the axe, and then he gets down to this very finely toned nail file, and he runs it over the top of it. And he realizes that as he does that, there's a little bit of dust that falls down, and he can capture that dust. And now he needs to see two things. If that dust is enough that we can find the DNA and find out if it has that trait, and did I take enough, a small enough amount, from the top of the seed, because if he nicks that part, it won't work, will it still grow? And it turns out this one tiny problem that he was trying to solve worked. And he was able to save all of those rows of corn being grown out just to find the one that had it in the right place. And that led them to what we call the billion-dollar idea, which is now, instead of going out and planting all of these seeds, we actually run them through these machines that grab them with a little suction. They have a camera that says which way is the germ at the bottom of the seed, turn it so that it won't be hit. A little tiny blade comes out, cuts it, the dust falls into a vial that we can go test, and the seed gets put away in cold storage so that if it's the right one, we can go plant it. There is no way that Kevin Depperman and his team could have ever imagined that machine. Just like the same person that was chipping the Ashwalian hand axe or then ended up building the Celtic axe could have ever thought about where their blades were going when they eventually would get into a sophisticated machine like this. They just solved the problem closest to them, which is exactly what you can be doing. And if you take your time and attention and the access that you have to professors and to problems that are all around you, you can begin to start solving problems that will stack up to be as complex and as beautiful as this. I always love this. In fact, I have it on my phone. I look at it all the time because I think it looks so gorgeous. And really, when you think of it, you can start to wonder, I wonder what that is. Is it a universe map or a galaxy? Is it a neural map? I don't know. But actually, what this is something that is tracking all the way back to those 9,000 years ago when you had little teosinte corn. This is a family tree of all of the inbred corn lines at Monsanto. All of the stars are different inbred lines, and all of the lines between them are when we've crossed two parents together to create a new type of hybrid, right? All of that complexity, all of that is shown there in all of its beauty comes from very simple things when people so long ago were taking teosinte and growing it up so that that way they could have popcorn at night to be able to feed themselves. And when you think about what it is that you want to do, your work doesn't have to be this incredible in your mind. A man named Stuart Brand always says, this present moment used to be the unimaginable future. Imagine the man making the Ashwalian hand axe thinking that his work would match up to this. If you focus your attention hard enough, your work, 5 years, 10 years, 30 years from now, can make something even more magnificent than this. They're the ones where the corn lines were bred the most because they had traits in them that were so valuable, like insect resistance or something. And so anyway, with that, thank you very much for all of your time and attention. This has been a great pleasure to... I believe we have some time remaining, and if you all are interested, I would be happy to entertain questions that are maybe more related to modern agriculture, or we can talk about things like how to make your attention more valuable.
It's my understanding that Monsanto has a fairly reasonable sounding explanation for why it finds it necessary to litigate when its seeds flow onto another adjacent farmer's property. Could you go over that?
Sure. So you're talking about the accusation that they have sued farmers that when their seeds had pollen that floated over into another person's field, that then those seeds were somehow then patented and we sued a farmer for that cross-pollination.
Right, exactly.
So our position is that although there have been farmers that have been sued over copyright violations for doing that, it's that it would be statistically impossible for pollen to have coated their fields so thoroughly that they would have had such a high concentration of genetically engineered seeds. And so it is likely that those farmers are fabricating that story, because it would not be possible for the cross-pollination to have created that in the same way.
Right, they're not innocent bystanders.
I think that's a fair way to put it, yes. I think we want to do the microphone for the video. Yeah.
Sure. So I haven't been following lately the recent developments with the dicamba litigation, and I also wanted to know if you have any idea of the issues that were related to the volatility of dicamba, how they were presented to Monsanto, like the first generation, and then.
Oh man, that is a complex question. So he's asking about an herbicide that is, so herbicides go out and kill weeds, and you can, in some cases, make plants resistant to that herbicide. So if you spray it over, say, soybeans, which are a broadleaf, dicamba kills broadleaves. And in this case, we were able to make a genetic engineered solution so that soybeans, when dicamba hit it, they didn't get killed by them. And it was the first year this summer was when you could have dicamba-tolerant soybeans, and people were using dicamba. The older formulations of this were what they call volatile. So what can happen with the older formulations are that when there is a large temperature change between when you spray and the evening, if the dicamba has not set on the plant, it can actually turn into a sort of mist and float away. Monsanto's position is that when we started selling dicamba, we actually reformulated it so it would have a low volatility. And if you followed the guidelines on it, that it wouldn't do that. So if you made sure you didn't spray it when it was too warm out, or the wind speed was correct, and you used the proper nozzles, there have now been farmers that are saying, I followed the rules and these things happened. And they're very, very complicated physics and chemistry questions that I am certainly not capable of answering. But it is one that I would encourage people as they're reading this to just remember these are very complicated subjects. And when they're written about in the newspaper, I would say they're often oversimplified. But I don't know that I could give a better or more accurate representation of it. Does that, I mean, at least that kind of gives you a level set for what was going on? Okay.
So you've given a lot of talks. What was the most interesting group you've given a talk to, and their reaction to it?
Oh, that's a fun question. So one of the ways that we think about how ideas spread is through, different communities or different tribes that people get into. And there's a very interesting community out there called the skeptics community. And the skeptics are an interesting bunch of people because they are people that say, I want to know what the evidence says about the world. And if you show me the evidence, then I will be convinced. And you guys probably know a skeptic, and you may not even know it. You guys all know Penn and Teller, right? A lot of people think that they're magicians. There's the tall guy who talks a bunch, and then the short guy who doesn't talk at all. Penn, I would say, is a professional skeptic. And what he does is he goes out and he says, what do we know to be scientifically true, right? And where are there people that are the furthest away from that are selling things that they know aren't true, right? Like palm reading or astrology. And then what he does is he goes and he interviews these people to find out, what do they believe? What are they selling? How are they positioning this? And he records it. And then he pulls the curtain off to show how far they are away from the truth. And he had an entire show on this called Bullshit, right? And it was on Showtime. You can still go watch all the old episodes on YouTube, and it's pretty clever. But there's an interesting thing that's actually an entire global phenomenon. There are people that get together in clubs and pubs all over the world. They have their own Reddit thread called R Skeptic. They have podcasts called the League of Nerds or the Prism podcast. And that's all they do is try and debunk pseudoscience. So I was invited to go on a 2-city pub crawl in Glasgow, Scotland, and Lewis, England. And so just like about an audience this size in a pub in Glasgow, Scotland, and it was a bunch of young college students that had a whole bunch of questions, and it was fun, and we joked around, and I thought that when I went to Lewis, England, which was in southern England, it's south of London, that it was going to be that same feeling, and it was not. Then the next time, 2 days later, I'm down there, and it was actually, instead of it being young college students, it was an audience of probably baby boomers, and most of them showed up like this, and they had questions, and they didn't really want answers. And so I spent about 2 hours having like really intense conversations, but I look back on that experience as the most forming for me. I like, in the US, the way that people communicate their frustration is really different than there. And what I was taking as hostility, they were taking as like, we're giving them a good Rogerin, you know? And so for me, it was like a very, very good experience. And it also helped me understand that just because another culture speaks English, and keep in mind, I have a master's degree in cross-cultural negotiations, but it really didn't dawn on me that the people in England would have so many cultural differences from us. And it really taught me a lot about how people think about problems.
Through your different occupation changes, when did you decide that you wanted to change or move to a different occupation?
Well, I was telling this story to this group over here. The Peace Corps actually is a 2-year commitment. And I went there, and when I got there, I was like, send me to the most remote village that you possibly can. I want to be off the map, right? And so I'm up in my village, up in the mountains, and I'm teaching malaria prevention. And I broke out in this terrible allergy, right? Just awful, from head to toe. And are you guys, a lot of you are from the Midwest, are any of you allergic to poison ivy, right? So imagine having poison ivy from head to toe. And it turns out that the mango plant family is in the same plant family as poison ivy. And poison ivy has this chemical called urushiol. That's the thing that breaks you out in hives if you're allergic to it. Well, mangoes, in the peel, if you're the one that cuts it open, it also has urushiol. So I've broken out from head to toe, and I'm like, this would be absolutely terrible if I didn't have all these mangoes to eat, because I didn't know it was the mangoes. And so in that experience, I left because of crippling allergy. But the other ones were oftentimes because I had started to figure out that the skill that I was going to be able to master from this thing that I was getting, like when I was working at the radio station, I had gotten the 2 years baseline. I was pretty good at running a radio. I knew how to sell ads for it. I knew how to do various things. And in order for me to get to the next level, I was going to have to commit really deeply. It was going to be a 5-year journey, and I didn't want that. I had kind of hit that plateau. And so I think that a good barometer for a job is, if you have learned the skills that you need, it might be time for you to look for a new position, unless you've said, this is the life's work that I want to do, and I want to hit the bottom of that curve, and I want to start going up. I just didn't have it in radio, and I would say the rest of my jobs were kind of that way.
So you said you can't eat mango, you yourself?
If somebody else peels it for me, I can, because urushiol is kind of like an alcohol, so it dries very quickly, which is why I couldn't figure it out, because for the first 3 months I was there, if I'd go over to visit somebody and they said, do you want a mango? I would say, sure, I love mangoes, and they would peel it for me. But when I had to start peeling my own, that's when the problem happened. I think, yeah.
Hi, so one of the things I was kind of hoping to hear a little bit about this evening was some of the different dimensions of concerns that people have. about GMOs. So I think often the debate gets focused on, oh, the public is afraid that it's risky to eat GMOs, and we often reduce the conversation to the public as being irrational about scientifically unproven risks. But one thing that I feel like doesn't get talked about nearly as much are people's ecological concerns. And I think the dicambia issue is an important example. So last I saw, 3.6 million acres of crops had been damaged by dicambia that has been sprayed since the rollout of the dicambia tolerant crop. And then there's also, I think, a lot of people, often respond that they're concerned about risks of GMOs when they may be having a gut reaction to industrial agriculture and monoculture. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the role of GMOs in monoculture and industrial culture.
Okay, so I'm not entirely, you may want to keep the microphone there because I may have clarifying questions. I know that when I first encountered Monsanto, when I was there in my interview, monoculture was one of those things that that's like a word that really held a lot of meaning to me, right? It was, why are you planting all of this corn in these straight rows? I don't see any of the rest of nature that way. What's going on here? And it wasn't until later, is that kind of where you're at on the monocultures, or why are you planting just soybeans here? Is that approximately where you're at?
And what you think the role of GMO crops are in monoculture as one dimension of sociological impacts.
Okay. So I'm not sure I understand your question, but I'll try to answer as best I can. As I understand it, you're asking, how do genetically engineered crops play into monocultures, which monocultures seem to be a part of industrialized agriculture, which feels uncomfortable to some people? Is that accurate?
Yeah, in terms of like food security, for example, if everything's planted, we have many acres of genetically identical crops. Like, what does that mean for food security, for example?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And actually, my sister lives in Wisconsin and lived on a permasteading farm for several years. And that was one of her very first questions that she had for me. And I think that one of the interesting things to note is, from this breeding tree, we actually have more diverse maize that we have in the last 100 years. It's more diverse than it's ever been, because we can cross different lines of corn in order that they have multiple modes of action and are prepared for the things that people get concerned about with monocrops, which is what happens if you have one fungal disease like they did in the potato blight and it wipes them all out. And so there is a higher diversity of corn genetics in our fields now than there has been since hybrids were invented, and really since you started having production agriculture as such. Genetic engineering does actually place certain traits in higher concentration than you would have for just bred out traits. So if you have, for example, the trait that allows corn to be resistant to Roundup, you're going to see that trait in a whole lot of corn, maybe 90% of the corn that's around in the United States. But I would say that allows it to be resistant to Roundup, but does not bring with it vulnerability to the types of disease pressure or insect pressures that people are worried about when they're talking about a single type of crop. So I take your point that if all of the corn were exactly the same, that would be dangerous. Or if the addition of a single gene like BT tolerant, or BT, so insect tolerance, or Roundup Ready, but that those don't add in inherent vulnerabilities to them, and that we're more diverse than we've been. Other questions?
So exactly, like what were some of the job details you had during your time at Monsanto?
So I've only had this job. This has been my only job as director of millennial engagement. And when I showed up, they didn't actually have a real clear view of what I was going to do. They had heard that the people that were concerned were moms, millennials, and food-minded. And to a corporation, that sounded like a really high fidelity map. But as the woman in the back is pointing out, if you distill down people into these large groups, moms or just millennials, then it makes it really hard to have conversations with people that have more nuanced and sophisticated questions. So my very first work, a lot of what I did was spending time traveling around the United States, trying to meet with different groups of people to say, who are the groups of people and what are their different types of concerns that we should be answering? And after I learned the kind of initial baseline part of Monsanto, then I went out and started to learn the baseline part of society. And I had a kind of a big advantage because I had worked in public radio, so that exposed me to certain people. I'd worked at the World Bank, I'd worked in the Peace Corps, so I kind of was able to go out and meet those people. And now I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out if I am not the right person to answer a complicated question, because either the way that I'm explaining it doesn't resonate with someone, or I don't have the depth of knowledge to be able to answer a question. I spend a lot of time both inside the company and outside the company trying to find people that are good at answering questions and convincing them that it is, one, worth their time, and two, worth the fear that they have that somebody's going to be mean to them or that their pushback will somehow harm them. Because that's a fear that a lot of farmers and scientists have. And so a lot of my work now is trying to find people that are better on different domains than I am to go out and talk to these various different groups that are out there.
Can you describe the event that you put on with Jordan Peterson last month?
Yeah, so Jordan Peterson is a psychology professor out of the University of Toronto. He formerly taught at Harvard, and one of his specializations is to talk about how mass movements get started. And one of the challenges that I've had with the farming community when I go speak, I've spoken to probably maybe 30,000 farmers in the last 3.5 years, is that farmers don't understand why people are so angry with them or why they are so upset about the way that they're growing crops. And so I invited Dr. Peterson because he has a long history in explaining how do the stories of an individual culture help you understand why the actions are happening in the present. And so he was invited to the American Farm Bureau, and they have an annual conference, and he did a workshop for about a room about this size, and the farmers in the room seemed to really like it.
Take one more question, otherwise we can wrap her up.
Yeah, you partly answered this already, but a concern I have, how much danger is there of a repetition of a phenomenon like the Irish potato famine, which, as I understand, was largely due to a monospecies culture?
Yeah, the Irish potato blight, and I'm speaking more from I have a small knowledge of this, so it's worth whatever I'm saying to go look up more in depth. But the genesis of potatoes came in Peru, right? So if you go to a certain set of mountain ranges in Peru, you will find the most diverse types of potatoes there. Some of them are purple, some of them are big, some of them are small. They have this adaptive radiation. They've gone out, and there's all different kinds. And the further that you get away from the radius of that, then the less types of potatoes can grow further away from that, because they aren't adapted. Those potatoes are adapted mostly to grow in those soils, but you can find certain ones and you can breed characteristics in them so that they could grow in more sandy soils or more moist environments. And the Irish potato blight came about because they were taking clones of a single potato, or maybe 2 breeds or so. Because a potato, you can cut it up into quarters, go plant it, and new potatoes will grow from them. They were taking the clones that were the easiest to grow from Peru to Ireland, or had moved over time to Ireland, and they were essentially planting clone after clone after clone of those, so that when a blight came around, you didn't have the diversity of all of these different things being bred together. You had only 1 or 2, and when that fungal pressure came through, it killed a vast majority of their potatoes. And so the difference would be they were using really similar clones that didn't have resistance, and that made them vulnerable. So to her earlier point, if you get into those situations, you are in peril of a single event knocking things down, whether it's a fungus or a certain kind of insect. So, well, this has been a great pleasure. I'm so grateful for your time, and I'll stick around and answer any other questions that people have. Thank you.